Look, I think that the CEO's role, General Manager's role, CEO's role is absolutely pivotal. Peter talked before about performance management systems and people saying, you shouldn't have systems in place because that's not the right way to go about it. But I don't agree with that. I think that an organisation does have to have a very robust and well understood performance management system, and which people understand and have had some involvement in its establishment. And where the CEO comes in, obviously, is ensuring that that performance management system is in place and that everybody participates in it, takes responsibility for participation. Now, I'll talk a little bit about performance management systems in a minute, but what I'll also say, though, is that that's not all it's all about. That's not enough. Performance management is about having a system, but also about ongoing performance management where people understand that they'll get feedback on an ongoing basis. It's not going to be only once or twice a year when they have that, when you get up in the morning and think, oh gosh, it's my performance appraisal today, isn't that awful? I don't know what it's going to be about. Or if you're a supervisor or a manager, I have to do it today. It really needs to be an ongoing process. But as far as the performance management system is concerned, and where I see I have to take the lead, is that it applies to everybody, and that includes me. And so the staff in the organisation at North Sydney certainly know that I have to go through a performance appraisal process as well with my council, and not that I run around telling everybody about it, but what is in my performance plan does cascade through the organisation, through the directors and through the other staff. All of our performance plans relate to the strategic objectives of the organisation. And I think that's what's important there is it means that people do understand, at whatever level they are in the organisation, that their work and their performance does contribute to the organisation achieving its outcomes. It makes it a little bit harder when you get down to somebody sweeping the street, but nevertheless we have a strategic objective which is about amenity within our council area, and for those people sweeping the street, they can understand that their performance adds to what the organisation is trying to achieve. And we do get community satisfaction surveys with feedback saying people are very happy with the cleanliness of our streets. So people can see their performance relates to what's being achieved out there and getting that performance. From the CEO's point of view, it's about having the systems in place, but also modelling the behaviour, not just saying you've got to do this, but I don't do it, but I do what everybody else has to do. And that's both being assessed myself, but also doing the performance assessment with my direct reports and the expectation that will cascade down through the organisation.
Good morning, everyone, and I thought I'd tell you just briefly a little bit about HammondCare. HammondCare is an independent Christian charity. We specialise in caring for people with dementia, people in palliative care, people in rehabilitation. So we have about 2,500 staff, about 500 volunteers, and turnover is about $170 million. Most importantly for what we're talking about today, our staff engagement score, particularly over the last 10 years or more as we've worked with the Voice and Monitor, that has always been in the 80s. And this year's survey score, it's 82%. And the score that we get on that part of the Voice survey around actions to prevent bullying and harassment behaviours is 81%. So you'd think, oh, David's going to stand up here and tell us how wonderful it is because there's never any bullying and harassment that goes on. But I also look after workers' compensation, and I also look after occupational health and safety, and we get bullying and harassment complaints, probably 5 or 6 a year. So I'm not going to sit up here and blow smoke at you about the fact that sometimes these things happen. But do you get that accountability for this system because you have a really, really good legalistic system? In thinking about this today, I thought I reflected back to a situation where I was working with a very senior manager who'd had an allegation of bullying and harassment made against him. And he shared this article with me, this headline from the Australian newspapers magazine in 2011. And it was actually about a WorkSafe in Victoria situation. And it was this: the Victorian government's bullying watchdog, which is WorkSafe, is fighting bullying claims from a former employee who's being represented by a law firm which is also being sued by their employees for bullying. and I thought, you know, I just don't think a legalistic approach of better policies or procedures or better training actually works. And from my experience, it doesn't. So I thought, what is it that HammondCare does, and a few stories that I could share with you about what we do that might be of assistance in 3 practical ways. So I thought I'd share 3 things with you. One, being driven by purpose and values. HammondCare has a very clear purpose, and we look to get engagement and alignment with individual employees with the values of the organisation. Now, we've always gone away from having, you know, 3 or 4 values that are very broad motherhood statements. We actually have 16 specific statements of values, and I just want to tell you about 2 of them. One of those is about learning and developing, and we all use what we learn. In early 2000s, HammondCare stopped doing performance appraisals altogether, and it's the best thing we ever did. What we do instead is we actually have a process of annual development meetings. So once a year, the employee sits down with their manager and we look at 3 things. We look back over the past year and say, what is it that has worked well for you this year? What has not worked well? What would you be like to be doing in the organisation? What are some of the challenges you're facing? So we look back. Second thing we do is we look at the capabilities needed, and those capabilities come off our business plan and our strategic plan, and we compare where a person's at in their job with the capabilities that are needed for the future, and then we come up with some ideas about how we build on those capabilities. And the third thing we do is then we build an individual learning plan. So unlike a performance appraisal where you get a score and you get, you know, you're fantastic, or you should leave now, please leave your keys on the desk. What you get is an individual learning plan that says, here are the coaching items, here are the development actions that we'll work on together over the next 12 months. That's what we do every year. Now, does that mean we don't address performance? And the answer is no, because another one of our values is we value open and honest communication, and we communicate in a timely and relevant manner. So if we have a performance issue with someone or someone's struggling, we deal with it as we go along the way. So there should be no surprises, and it's immediate. And we deal with, and so we do have a performance management and improvement policy, of course, but we don't do that as part of some sort of annual sort of performance appraisal. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I want to tell you about a saying that we have in HammondCare, which comes from the chief executive down, and that is, you are what you tolerate. And I think what I wanted to share with you on that front is that if people raise bullying and harassment concerns, we treat that really seriously, so we investigate it straight away. If the people services team, and a number of them are here today in the audience, haven't identified a bullying and harassment complaints made, we stop, we investigate it. Sometimes we have to validate it, sometimes we don't validate it, and then we keep going with the process. So we're not frightened of it, but we deal with it, and we deal with it immediately. The second thing I think about it is that it's also about your employment practices. There's another saying we have in HammondCare, I think, that I'd rather employ someone with no skills than a bully with a certificate. And I think too often we recruit for skills, but we fire for fit. And really it should be the other way around. We should be recruiting for fit and that alignment with the values, and then dealing with skills along the way through development. And I think too often we get it around the wrong way. So I think HammondCare, that's one of the things that we get around the right way. So being driven by values and purpose, you are what you tolerate. And the third and final thing I want to share with you is another saying that we have in HammondCare, which is the fish rots from the head. So the question we had before, which was how do we, what's something that we do when you get, I think someone over here was asking about, how do you get that senior management engagement? And I thought one thing I thought that I might share with you that might be helpful is that the senior management and the executive team do have an at-risk component in their salary, and one of the key elements of that at-risk component is the Voice Staff Engagement Survey score. Now that really focuses the mind of senior people when a big part of your salary is at risk with the score that you get. And then also we then use the Voice Survey 360-degree leadership survey as well as a way of monitoring as colleagues with each other our performance in those areas. And I think that's a great way of being able to spot quickly when the head of the fish has started to rot, to use that phrase. So anyway, so there's 3 ideas about how we build that accountability. Thanks.
Chris, organisations tend to be fearful of bullying, yet often the perpetrators are senior and protected. How do organisations become more accountable?
Thank you.
Over to you, Chris.
So my background is entirely in private sector. I've worked in a range of industries and in companies from startups right through to different levels of evolution in the mature companies, different levels of evolution in their history as well. And in each of those occasions, at each of these companies, there's always been a need for transformational change. And transformational change, as we know, is really culture change, right? And culture is not just a simple thing. As we know, it takes usually about 3 to 5 years to actually achieve culture change in a business. But one of the things, if we break down culture to its absolute simple base level, it's around the conversations, about the conversations we have with our people. You can have a performance management discussion, or you can have a discussion around mutual success. You can have a discussion that says, you're not achieving your goals and we've got to do something about that. Or you can have a conversation that says, let's talk about why you're not being successful. The tone is different, the context is different, but I can tell you the outcome from my experience is a lot more powerful. And that's really the starting point for the culture change in the business. Of course, you need to get culture change. What I've found as well is you need to have accountability. It needs to be driven from the senior leadership down, and you need to have senior managers held accountable, and that's where the challenge usually lies. And having the support of the CEO, of course, helps, but you can't rely on that support all the time. And I'd like to share with you the sorts of things that we've done in my experience anyway across the different companies that have actually helped us achieve that accountability. So really, to get accountability from the senior leadership down, you really need to have a look at implementing mechanisms of exposure. Now, what I mean by that is that you're looking at things such as declarations or statements of intent around the culture. They include vision, mission and values, for example, and some organisations have those up on the wall, but those organisations that do well actually live by those, and they're really important because employees keep you to that standard. So that's an exposure mechanism alone. But then the other exposure mechanisms are the tools that we use in the HR framework to help align and enable the culture we're trying to build. And those things are simple things like KPI setting. Really important for employees to understand from the outset what's expected of them. You go through a process of agreeing KPIs, you're setting those KPIs, then you've got a basis for which to have a discussion right throughout the year. That means that the manager has to keep to those KPIs and manage to those KPIs and not wander off those as well. That's an exposure mechanism. If you have KPIs linked to an appraisal system that is then linked to a reward system, and you have all of these aligned, they're all exposure systems again, right? So, for example, in our organisation, we do have appraisals, okay, and they work very well. Part of the appraisal is around your KPIs that are set. So the results, the outcomes you're looking to achieve in your job, and the rest of it is around behavioural competencies. So it's not about just the outcomes, but it's about how you've gone about achieving the outcomes, and that works very, very well, particularly when you then link it to rewards. And we've got a pay for performance system which links to some sort of measured outcome. Okay, so that's all important part of the exposure mechanisms. Managers don't have anywhere to hide if you've got these mechanisms in place. Another important one is your talent identification and succession planning processes. That's a significant exposure mechanism because what happens there is that if you have your talent ID processes and succession planning processes linked to performance, which is linked to KPIs, which is linked to appraisals, which is linked to all those reward mechanisms you have in place, then can you just imagine the meeting that takes place around the exec table where you're looking at succession planning discussions and talent ID discussions, and one of the senior execs wants to put forward a recommendation for an inclusion of a particular manager in the talent pool, and that manager has a history of poor behaviour in the business, right? And that exec has to justify that person to the rest of the executive team around the table. Okay? It makes it very difficult. That's an exposure mechanism that's very powerful then, again, and it makes sure that executives understand that they are being scrutinised at all levels. We're putting pressure on the senior execs from the top through the board mandating change in the organisation and wanting to see the organisation change through culture. And we're also putting pressure from the bottom by having these processes in place that that yield equity and fairness and an alignment through to the organisational behaviours that we're looking for in achieving that culture. So these exposure mechanisms have really worked powerfully for us in the past, to the point, I've got to say, where in one of the organisations it has led to the removal of a CEO. So the CEO in question was supportive of organisational change. Intellectually, he understood the value and the need for it. The board was requiring it as well. So intellectually he understood it, but when he came to behaving and making the changes personally, he found that the old power games he didn't want to let go of. And that was undermining the whole culture effort, and it became apparent in all of the processes that we had in place. It became apparent. The way he was completing appraisals for his exec team, for example, it became apparent in the way he was looking at identifying people for succession planning. It became apparent to the board, and his fellow directors then decided that he was actually standing in the way of progress for the business, and they elected to remove him from the business. And all because of these exposure mechanisms. So it is powerful. You've got to have those in place, but I've got to tell you, if you have a combination of both those processes in place and a really strong support from the CEO, you can't fail.
Okay, well maybe I'll just sort of get the ball rolling in relation to the CEO not investing the time in the relationship, more about the outcomes of business. But I suppose, I think that can be absolutely right. It's a matter of leadership style. For myself, I can only speak for myself here and then reflect, I suppose, on what I see with others, is that in fact, a huge part of leadership of an organisation is in the relationships that the CEO has with people within the organisation. And a CEO who sees themselves as just, what are the outcomes I've got to achieve, forget who's going to actually achieve them, is in fact going to be not successful at all as a CEO, because they're not going to be able to lead the people to achieve the outcomes. And so for me, investing in the relationship is absolutely crucial, and that means not just talking to the people who are directly reporting to you or their reports, but in fact within the realms of possibility relating to everybody in the organisation. And I've talked before about having this diverse team at North Sydney Council, and it's very diverse, but every single person in the organisation is important, because without that person, we're not going to be able to do what we have to do for the community and internally. And so, as a CEO, or general manager, I see myself as relating to all of those individuals within the realms of possibility, within a 24-hour day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Because otherwise you just don't achieve what you're going to achieve as an organisation, because people just don't feel that they're valued. That answers the first part of the question, the one about bullying upwards. I think that can be absolutely true. People can be frightened of confronting, supervisors or managers or directors or CEOs can be frightened of confronting poor behaviour in people that report to them, because in fact those people are very strong and obnoxious, and can pay out on you if you don't confront what they're doing. So I think that could be a real issue if you don't tackle it head on.
I'd only say I can't answer that question because that's not my experience of CEOs. But I just wanted to add one answer to it, which is the impact of that the leader has in terms of setting the positive behaviour. And an example of that I'd like to share is that getting and encouraging senior people and chief executives to reinforce positive, rewarding behaviours for no other purpose other than it's a positive reinforcing behaviour is a really powerful thing. I was sharing a story yesterday about one of the challenges in HammondCare has been to, and the joys has been to see the chief executive and other senior leaders pick up the phone and ring someone for no other purpose other than to say, "Oh, I just spotted you doing this thing last week, and I just want to say thanks. Bye." Because it usually goes, "Hi, I just wanted to ring you to say thanks. And by the way, while I've got you, can you do and can you address And certainly I've found amazingly that a handwritten letter from the chief executive, which is from my experience of what the chief executive does, that's taken the time to write it out on a piece of paper and sign it, people put that stuff up on their walls. And it has such a positive impact about setting the tone, I think, for positively reinforcing the behaviours, which then, I think, undermine and eliminate some of those issues about bullying and harassment and good performance management.
Yep. And I've got to say, my experience also with CEOs and investing the time, I've worked across a very different style of CEOs, but it's very enjoyable working with the current CEO who basically, when we're having a performance review discussion about the business, looking at underperforming stores, for example, underperforming businesses, the very first thing he would say, he'll turn around to the head of that business and to me and say, do we have a leadership problem in that business? Right? So he recognises that the issues are around people and around the morale and around investing in the right culture and skills to make that successful, because the numbers just don't come by themselves. Right? So that's that point. In terms of upward bullying, yes, you get to see a bit of that around the place, right? And it's all got to do with the skilling up the supervisors. But in order to be able to do that, you've got, as Pete said before in his presentation about from the survey results, it's really setting that culture where that can happen. And a lot of if you do set that culture up, the bullies that try upward bullying usually get turned on by their colleagues. In a culture where it's right, their colleagues turn around and say that's unacceptable, and they'll support the supervisor. And of course, if you have HR support for the supervisor, you work through that. But we find that their colleagues are the ones that actually step up to the plate and saying that's unacceptable. That's not in line with our cultural objectives.
Yep, I'll just give an example again to answer that question from HammondCare's point of view. So the senior executive and leadership of the organisation, with the support of staff, set the values, which then the board reviews with us and signs off on. So the board are happy with the values and agrees and supports it. And the second example I would say is that the board monitor the voice survey and the engagement survey results and challenge us on it. HammondCare's board is probably best described as probably a board of review and governance rather than a board of management. So it's management's job to lead the organisation and set the tone, but certainly the board holds the senior management of HammondCare accountable and wants to, and asks challenging questions and wants to know, when we get these issues of cultural feedback from the survey with what staff are saying, what are we doing about it, what are the implications, how are we going to improve and change about it. So that's two examples from HammondCare about how we do it at Hammond.
Maybe I'll just talk about it from a local government perspective, which is somewhat different because our board is an elected council. And I think the process of getting people getting elected to council is quite different from people getting appointed to boards, where people appointed to boards are searched and handpicked based on what skills they're going to bring to those positions. In councils, it's an open election, so anybody, as long as they haven't committed a crime, basically, and broken the age of 18, can get elected to a council. So you can get a whole range of different people on councils. You can get really fantastic councils, you can get terrible councils, you can get hybrid councils, and it just really depends on who you've got. But the council does in fact play a very important role in setting the tone. The general manager and the executive team really the organisation, but a council does set the tone for the organisation, and the organisation and the staff really do look to the council to get an idea of where the council's coming from. So with a great council, you can get a great tone set at the top, and a bad council you can get a very bad tone set at the top, and it's very hard then for the general manager to try to minimise that that effect. It's a different situation, I think, than in the private sector where you've got hand-picked boards. So you've got to play with what you've got and try to either maximise what comes through the council or minimise the effect of the council, one or the other.
And certainly in my experience, if you don't have the board supporting or understanding that culture plays an important role in enabling the achievement of the profit objectives of the business, then you're really left to the CEO to actually have that focus. If the CEO and the board don't have that same interest, then it's never going to be spoken at that level, and I would dare say that emphasis is not going to happen in the business. That the conversations in the business are going to be around numbers and transactions, as opposed to people and enabling people to achieve those numbers. So you really, I mean, ideally, of course, it's important to have the board and the CEO unified in terms of that and having that focus at that board level. But if one of them doesn't have that focus, then it's a challenge.
Probably two things then to say in that. One is that the chief executive is the chief team builder and the chief strategist in Hammond. So the 5-year planning cycle that we have, which we call Future Directions, which is our aspirational plan, is set by the chief executive and the senior executive, signed off by the board, and then that's devolved through the organisation. So that tends to give us sort of the directional path that we're headed on in the organisation, and we communicate that. And more importantly, I think, because we're getting better at being really good storytellers, that's the stories that we tell, and try and teach other people to tell those stories to devolve that down through the organisation. The second thing is that each business unit, whether it's residential aged care or hospitals or Hammond at Home, has their own KPIs that they measure their performance under. And I think that those then build up into some of the key performance indicators for the business, which are also in the at-risk component for the senior executives in terms of pay. But we don't have a system of then saying that every manager has necessarily a key set of key performance measures. But what they're driven by is the values of the organisation and the strategic plan of the organisation and achieving good outcomes of care for people. That's how we do it.
So if I can answer from the private sector perspective, in our organisation, no company-initiated termination takes place without it being referred to the HR team. So we then ensure that we go through a proper process, and there are documented processes that they've got to follow in order to actually even reach a written warning stage. So we ensure that there is a proper and fair process along the way in terms of performance. And then if it gets to that discussion around success and why you're not successful, we provide performance improvement plans and so forth. And if they still fail on that, we go to a warning stage and so forth, right? So we all have those sort of processes in place. And the appraisal process, similarly, we don't have an automated process yet. We're trying to. But we do ensure that we have a reporting of the outcomes of those appraisals, because they are linked to a salary review process as well. And if they're not done and sent through centrally, there is no participation in the salary review process.